Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Over the Gate by Miss Reed. It's winter, Christmas is past, spring is far away, and Miss Reed is having a black week. Things have been going wrong all week long. The snow did not cease all day, and I drove Mrs. Crossley home after tea through a positive blizzard. Luckily, the roads were passable, and I was soon home again. There was still no word from Mrs. Pringle, and I could hear Mr. Willett manfully filling the Coke buckets as I put the car away. What would Thursday hold, I wondered, as I plowed through the snow to my front door. It held, I discovered next morning, 3 more cases of mumps and no word from Mrs. Pringle. It was still bitterly cold, but the snow had stopped during the night. I crunched it underfoot as I crossed the playground and could imagine the snowballing that would delight the children at playtime. The stoves had resumed their sulky behavior and filled the 2 classrooms with smoke. We tried the damper open, shut, and halfway open with exactly the same result. At length we resigned ourselves to the inevitable and resumed our interrupted work on fractions in the midst of an acrid blue haze. The vicar called during the morning. The Reverend Gerald Partridge is as near a saint as it would be possible to find in any village. His mild, sweet face usually wears a vague, benign smile, but today he appeared much agitated. At the sight of the smoke, his alarm grew. "Good heavens!" he cried aghast. "Are you on fire?" "I wish we were," I replied. "We are only smoldering. The stoves object to a northeast wind." "It all looks very uncomfortable," said the vicar, approaching the tortoise stove warily, as though expecting it to explode. "I gather that Mrs. Pringle is not with you at the moment," he added delicately. I told him why. Yes, I heard that there had been a little upset," he nodded understandingly. He is much too wise and diplomatic to take sides. "And in any case, I suspect that he thinks our little upsets are 6 of Mrs. Pringle's making and half a dozen of mine." And he is probably right. The vicar now began to twist his leopard skin gloves together unhappily. "I have a really dreadful confession to make, Miss Reed," he began. "I simply cannot put my hand on that pamphlet you lent me about religious books for the young from Oxford University Press." "It doesn't matter in the least," I assured him. I had quite finished with it. But he seemed too sunk in self-mortification to hear. "You see, I put it most carefully on the hall table, and this morning my wife and the 2 girls began spring cleaning." The 2 girls, incidentally, are 2 buxom Fairacre matrons of 62 and 65. "And not only had the pamphlet gone," continued the poor man, "but the hall table and the rugs and the chairs. And to tell you the truth, every room in the house is completely upside down." Knowing his wife's vigor and the matching energy of the 2 girls, I could imagine the state of the vicarage only too clearly. This visit, I suspected, might be in the nature of a brief escape. I did my best to calm his fears and accompanied him out to his car. "Just look at that splendid bullfinch!" exclaimed Mr. Partridge, his face lighting up. "Splendidly picking off my plum buds," I responded grimly, though I had to admit that the vivid little creature was a cheering sight on the bleak day. The vicar climbed into his car and looked at me anxiously through the window. "Don't hesitate to close the school, my dear, if the stoves prove too intractable. It can't be good for your lungs or the dear children's to inhale those fumes. What a pity Mrs. Pringle is away. She is the tiniest bit difficult, I realize, but she has a wonderful way with stoves." Before I could reply, he gave me a disarming smile, let in the clutch, and shot erratically away down the lane. During the dinner hour, I consulted Mr. Willett about my little cat. For several days he had been off his food, and I had supposed that a diet of local mice had been preferred to the delicacies offered by me. But this morning he looked wretched, sitting foursquare with paws tucked under him and his eyes half closed. "Furballs," pronounced Mr. Willett. "I'll get the vet," I said at once. "Ain't no need to get him out from Caxley," said Mr. Willett. "You give old Tib a spoonful of liquid paraffin to oil the works. He'll be as right as rain tomorrow." "Are you sure?" I asked doubtfully. Positive, Mr. Willett assured me. This time of year they loses their winter coats, see, and keeps all a-licking themselves tidy and swallering great hanks of hair. It gets all twizzled up inside 'em. Liquid paraffin's the stuff. I thanked him and watched him return to his daily coke sweeping. What a tower of strength and information Mr. Willett was. I poured out a dessert spoonful of liquid paraffin and approached the unsuspecting cat. It is not easy to open a cat's mouth in order to administer medicine, as everyone knows. It is harder still when you are attempting it alone, and particularly when you have been foolish enough to pour out the dose beforehand and are trying not to spill it. Somehow or other I got most of it into the side of Tibby's mouth, and was just beginning to congratulate myself when he gave his head a violent shake and ejected at least half the oil over my beautiful new suede shoes. I returned, growling, to afternoon school, recounting my luck to Mr. Willett en route. "I'll give you a hand after school," he said cheerfully. "You always wants two to cope with the cat, and then the cat nearly always wins." He looked at my stained shoes sadly. "It do seem to be one of those weeks, don't it?" he observed. I agreed, with feeling. There was still no word from Mrs. Pringle on Friday morning. Although it was delightful to be without her presence, the school was beginning to look a little worse for wear, despite my own efforts and Mr. Willett's. The snow, luckily, was melting fast, but plenty managed to find its way into the building. With it were the usual flotsam and jetsam of school life, and a plentiful sprinkling of additional matter from the workmen at the Blundell's new home. "If anyone brings any more nails, putty, or shavings into this school," I said threateningly, "I shall ring up the builders and tell them what is happening." The putty, in particular, was a sore trial. It seemed to be the thing to have a small lump under one's desk or about one's person, and the children's hands had never been so filthy. By dint of constant nagging, I was beginning to make a little headway against this infiltration. We were all glad that it was Friday. It had been a trying week for everyone. By the afternoon, I was beginning to feel a little more hopeful. The stoves were emitting only half as much smoke as before. Only one more case of mumps had occurred overnight. Tibby appeared to be on the mend. A new pane of glass had replaced the broken one, and I had decided to find a substitute for Mrs. Pringle if I did not hear from the lady during the weekend. But fate still had one more blow in store for us. Jimmy Waits, on returning from play, set up a wail. "I been and lost my half-crown." "Where was it?" I inquired. "Under my desk. Someone's pinched it." Now, if anything makes me cross, it is this kind of glib accusation. I spoke sharply. "Rubbish. And in any case, you know you should have given it to me to mind. What was it for?" "Half a cheddar, 2 boxes of matches, and a pricker for the Primus," gabbled Jimmy. Obviously, he had been repeating this to himself all afternoon. Then began the search. We turned the whole place upside down. We shifted desks, turned out likely cupboards, and completely wrecked the room. It was not to be found. Our Friday afternoon story had to go by the board. By now I was beginning to wonder if someone perhaps had succumbed to temptation. The half-crown had been seen by Jimmy's neighbors. It was there at playtime. Jimmy had been in and out of the room himself during that time. It was a mystery that must be solved. "We'd better look in our clothes," I said. It is a job that I hate doing, but things looked suspicious. Pockets were turned out, socks rolled down, children jumped up and down to see if any coins would emerge from jerseys and trousers, but nothing was forthcoming. By now it was time to say prayers and go home. In the middle of the hubbub, the door opened, and in stumped Mrs. Pringle, complete with black bag. She surveyed the chaos grimly. "Seems this place wants a bit of doing up," she boomed, but made no move to discard her coat and hat. "Sit down for a moment, Mrs. Pringle," I said. "We're in rather a pickle." "That," said the lady with emphasis, "is plain for all to see." She folded her arms across her capacious bosom and watched the scene majestically. "We'll have one last look," I said desperately to the children. "It must be somewhere in this room. If it doesn't turn up now, I shall have to think about keeping you all here until it is found." There was something in my tone that made them realize the seriousness of the occasion, and they began to look frenziedly about them, bending under desks, running their hands along the high window sills, and scrabbling in the dusty corners of the classroom. Quite rightly, they resented being suspected, and I hated just as much the feeling that I was suspecting them. It was Mrs. Pringle who discovered the half-crown. The only calm person in the room, she had perhaps a clearer eye than the rest of us. "If it's a coin you're looking for," she shouted above the din, "it's there." She pointed at the back view of Jimmy Waits himself. The child was kneeling under his desk, and cleaving to the instep of his Wellington boot was a glutinous lump of the ubiquitous putty. There, embedded in it, was the missing half-crown. After we had congratulated Mrs. Pringle and each other, I improved the shining hour by pointing out the absolute necessity of leaving putty severely alone, and then dismissed them. There was genuine relief in their farewells. The dark shadow of distrust was lifted, the half-crown was restored, and Fairacre School could relax again. "The vicar told me he was in trouble," said Mrs. Pringle austerely when the children had gone, "and though I doubt if my knee will ever be the same again, I knows where my duty lies." She advanced, limping, toward the stove. "Been letting it smoke, have you?" she said. I felt that this was hardly the correct expression, but was not given time to reply. To my amazement, Mrs. Pringle lifted a mighty hand and smote the pipe about a foot above the stove itself. The smoke, which had been dribbling gently from the crack in the lid, ceased emerging immediately. "Gets a bit out of true sometimes," observed Mrs. Pringle with satisfaction. "Well, I'll get the place to rights while I'm here, so's we can be straight for next week." "Thank you, Mrs. Pringle," I said meekly, bowing my head with secret relief to the inevitable. Chapter 7. The Fairacre Ghost. The Easter holidays are probably more welcome than any other, for they mark the passing of the darkest and most dismal of the 3 school terms, and they herald the arrival of flowers, sunshine, and all the pleasures of the summer. At this time in Fairacre we set about our gardens with zeal. Potatoes are put in, on Good Friday if possible, and rows of peas and carrots, and those who have been far-sighted enough to put in their broad beans in the autumn go carefully along the rows, congratulating themselves, and hoping that the black fly will not devastate the young hopefuls in the next few months. We admire each other's daffodils, walk down each other's garden paths, observing the new growth in the herbaceous borders, and gloat over the buds on plum and beech trees. We also observe the strong upthrust of nettles, couchgrass, and dandelions among the choicer growth, but we are too besotted by the thought of summer ahead to let such things worry us unduly. It is now that the vicar gets out his garden furniture, a motley collection ranging from Victorian ironwork to pre-war Lloyd loom, and arranges it hopefully on the vicarage veranda. Now Mr. Maughan, our local ornithologist, erects a hide at the end of his lovely garden in order to watch the birds. He weaves a bower of pea sticks, ivy trails, and twigs upon the wooden sacking framework as intricate as the nests of those he watches. Now the cottage doors are propped open with a chair or a large stone, and striped cats wash their ears or survey the sunshine blandly through half-closed eyes. Tortoises emerge, shaky and slower than ever from their hibernation, and sometimes a grass snake can be seen sunning itself in the dry grass. This is the time for visiting and being visited. For months we have been confined. Bad weather, dirty roads, dark nights, and winter illnesses have kept us all apart. Now we set about refurbishing our friendships, and one of my first pleasures during this Easter holiday was a visit from my godson Malcolm Annett and his father and mother. It was a perfect day for a tea party. The table bore a bowl of freshly picked primroses, some lemon curd made that morning, and a plentiful supply of egg sandwiches. Mr. Roberts, the farmer, has a new batch of Rhode Island red hens who supply me with a dozen dark brown eggs weekly. These are lucky hens, let me say, garrulous and energetic, running at large in the farmyard behind the house, scratching busily in the loose straw at the foot of the ricks, and advancing briskly to the back door whenever anyone emerges holding a plate. No wonder that their eggs are luscious compared with the product of their poor imprisoned sisters. After tea, we ambled through the village, greeting many old friends who were out enjoying the air. Mrs. Annett used to teach at Fairacre before she married the headmaster at our neighboring village Beech Green, so she knows a great many families here. Mr. Annett is choirmaster at St. Patrick's Church at Fairacre, so he too knows us all well. We walked by the church and took a fork to the left. It is a lane little used these days, except by young lovers and Mr. Roberts' tractors making their way to one of his larger fields. A dilapidated cottage stands alone some 100 yards from the entrance to the lane. We stopped at its rickety gate and surveyed the outline of its ancient garden. A damson tree, its trunk riven with age, leant toward the remaining patch of roof thatch. Rough grass covered what once had been garden beds and paths, and nettles and brambles grew waist-high against the walls of the ruin. The doors and windows gaped open. Inside, on the ground floor, in what had once been the living room of the cottage, we could see hundredweight paper bags of fertilizer propped against the stained and ragged wallpaper. They belonged to Mr. Roberts, and were waiting to be spread upon his meadows any day now. Upstairs, the 2 small bedrooms lay open to the sky. The thatch had retreated before the onslaught of wind and weather, and only the frame of the roof stood, gaunt and rotting, against the evening sky. "It must have been pretty once," I said, looking at the triangle of garden and the rose red of the old bricks. "The vicar told me it was lived in during the war," said Mr. Annett. "It housed a family of 8 evacuees. They didn't mind it being haunted, they told Mr. Roberts." "Haunted?" we cried. I looked at Mr. Annett to see if he was joking, but his face was unusually thoughtful. "It is, you know," he said with conviction. "I've seen the ghost myself. That's how I came to hear the story of the place from the vicar." "Is that why it stands empty?" I asked. It was strange that I had never heard this tale throughout my time at Fairacre. Mr. Annett laughed. "No, indeed. I told you the people lived in it for years. The evacuees said they'd sooner be haunted than bombed, and spent all the war years here. I think Roberts just found it wasn't worth doing up after the war, so it is now in this state." We looked again at the crumbling cottage. It was too small and homely to be sinister, despite this tale of a ghost. It had the pathetic look of a wild animal, tired to death, crouching in the familiar shelter of grass and neglected vegetation for whatever fate might have in store. "When did you see the ghost?" I asked. Mr. Annett sighed with mock impatience. "Persistent woman! I see I shall have no peace until I've put the whole uncomfortable proceedings before you. It was a very frightening experience indeed, and if you don't mind, I'll tell you the story as we walk. Even now my blood grows a little chilly at the memory. Brisk exercise is the right accompaniment for a ghost story." We continued up the lane, with young Malcolm now before, now behind us, scrambling up the banks and shouting with the sheer joy of living. With the sense of spring around us and the soft wind lifting our hair, we listened to the tale of one strange winter night. Every Friday night, with the exception of Good Friday, Mr. Annett left the schoolhouse at Beech Green and traveled the 3 miles to St. Patrick's Church for choir practice. Some men would have found it irksome to leave the comfort of their homes at 7 in the evening and to face the windy darkness of a downland lane. Mr. Annett was glad to do so. His love of music was strong enough to make this duty a positive pleasure, and although his impatient spirit chafed at times at the slow progress made by Fairacre's choir, he counted Friday evening as a highlight of the week. At this time he had much need of comfort. He was a young widower, living alone in the schoolhouse and ministered to by a middle-aged Scotswoman who came in daily. The death of his wife, 6 months after their marriage, was still too painful for him to dwell upon. She had been killed in an air raid during the early part of the war, and for Mr. Annett life would never be the same again. One moonlit Friday evening in December, some years after the war had ended, he set out as usual for Fairacre. It was so bright that he could have driven his little car without headlights. The road glimmered palely before him, barred with black shadows where trees lined the road. He was early, for he had arranged to pick up some music from Miss Parr's house, and knew that the old lady would want him to stop for a little time. A maid opened the door. Miss Parr had been invited to her nephew's, but the music had been looked out for him, Mr. Annet was told. He drove to St. Patrick's and went inside. It was cold and gloomy. No one had yet arrived, and Mr. Annet decided to use his time in taking a stroll in the brilliant moonlight. There was an unearthly beauty about the night that chimed with the young man's melancholy. He made his way slowly along a little used lane near the church and let sad memory carry him on its flood. It was not often that he so indulged himself. After his wife's death, he had moved to Beech Green and thrown himself almost savagely into school life. He had filled his time with work and music so that he fell asleep with exhaustion rather than the numbing despair which had first governed every waking hour. He passed a broken-down cottage on his left, its remnants of thatch silvered with moonlight. Just beyond its 5-barred gate afforded a view of the distant downs. Mr. Annet leaned upon its topmost bar and surveyed the scene. Before him lay freshly plowed fields, the furrows gleaming in the rays of the moon. Further away, a dusky copse made a black patch on the lower flanks of the downs. Against the clear night, their mighty bulk looked more majestic than ever. There was something infinitely reassuring and comforting about their solidity, and the young man, gazing at them, let the tranquillity about him do its healing work. It was very quiet. Far away, he heard a train hoot impatiently as it waited for a signal to allow its passage westward. Nearer, he was dimly conscious of the rustling of dead leaves at the foot of an old crab-apple tree which stood hard by the gate. Some small nocturnal animal was foraging stealthily, wary of the silent man nearby. Sunk in his thoughts, he was oblivious of the passage of time, and hardly surprised to notice that a strange man had appeared in the lane without any noise of approach. He came close to Mr. Annet, nodded civilly, and leaned beside him on the gate. For a moment the two men rested silently, side by side, elbows touching, and gazed at the silvered landscape before them. Despite the stranger's unexpected advent, Mr. Annet felt little surprise. There was something gentle and companionable about the newcomer. The schoolmaster had the odd feeling that they were very much akin. Vaguely he wondered if they had met somewhere before. He shifted along the gate. The stranger seemed excessively cold, and turned slightly to look at him. He was a loosely built fellow of about Annet's age, dressed in dark country clothes which seemed a pretty poor fit. He wore an open-necked shirt and a spotted handkerchief tied gypsy fashion round his throat. He had a short beard, light in color, which gleamed silver in the moonlight, and his fair hair was thick and wiry. "Full moon tonight," commented the stranger. For such a big man, he had a remarkably small voice, Mr. Annet noted. It was almost a falsetto, slightly husky, and strained as though he were suffering from laryngitis. "So it is," agreed Annet. They relapsed again into contemplation of the view. After some time, Mr. Annet stirred himself long enough to find some cigarettes. He offered the packet to his companion. "Thank ye," said the man. "Thank ye kindly, but I don't smoke these days." The schoolmaster lit his cigarette and surveyed the man. "Haven't I seen you somewhere before?" he asked. "Most likely. I've lived in Fairacre all my life," answered the man huskily. "I'm at Beech Green," said Mr. Annet. The man drew in his breath sharply, as though in pain. "My wife came from Beech Green," he said. He bent his head forward suddenly. By the light of the moon, Mr. Annet saw that his eyes were closed. The use of the past tense was not lost upon the schoolmaster, himself still smarting with grief, and he led the conversation from the dangerous ground he had unwittingly encountered. "Whereabouts in Fairacre do you live?" he asked. The man raised his head and nodded briefly in the direction of the ruined cottage nearby. Mr. Annet was puzzled by this, but thought that perhaps he was nodding generally in the direction of the village. Not wishing to distress him any further, and realizing that his choir must soon be arriving at St. Patrick's, Mr. Annet began to stir himself for departure. It was time he moved, in any case, for he had grown colder and colder since the arrival of the stranger, despite his warm overcoat. The stranger only had on a long jacket, but he seemed oblivious of the frost. "Well, I must be off," said Mr. Annett. "I'm due to take choir practice at 7:30. Are you walking back to the village?" The man straightened up and turned to face the schoolmaster. The moonlight shone full upon his face. It was a fine face, with high cheekbones and pale blue eyes set very wide. There was something Nordic in his aspect, with his great height and wide shoulders. "I'll stop here a little longer," he said slowly. "This is the right place for me. I come most nights, particularly around full moon." "I can understand it," Mr. Annett said gently, scanning the sad, grave face. "There is comfort in a lovely place like this." A burst of laughter broke from the stranger's lips, all the more uncanny for its cracked wheeziness. His wide-open eyes glittered in the moonlight. "Comfort?" he echoed. "There's no comfort for the likes of me, ever." He began to tear savagely at the neckerchief about his throat. "You can't expect comfort," he gasped painfully, "when you've done this to yourself." He pulled the cloth away with a jerk and tore his shirt, opening away from his neck with both hands. By the light of the moon, Mr. Annett saw the livid scar which encircled his neck, the mark of a strangling rope which eternity itself could never remove. He raised his horror-filled eyes to those of the stranger. They were still wide open, but they glittered no longer. They seemed to be dark, gaping holes full of mist, through which Mr. Annett could dimly discern the outline of the crabbed apple tree behind him. He tried to speak, but could not, and as he watched, still struggling for speech, the figure slowly dissolved, melting into thin air, until the schoolmaster found himself gazing at nothing at all but the old gnarled tree and the still beauty of the night around it. And we'll learn the story of the Fairacre Ghost next time.